This episode is made possible by our Patreon supporters, Cornelia Weiss, Aaron Gattuso, Kim Hokinson, Julie Gray, Jan-Elise Cannon, Heather McKinnon, Jill Harrigan, Michaela Frew, Valerie Jacobson, Amanda Gilmore, Maria Carla Sanchez, Jamie Lang, Chantel Oliver, Lindsay Cummings, and Peyton S.
Hi, Katie. Hi, Olivia. Are we whispering? Yes.
We have to speak quietly.
Okay.
We are in a courtroom in Brooklyn, New York. And we are waiting for the verdict in the case of 57-year-old Mary Ware Dennett. Dennett has been charged with distributing obscene material through the United States Postal Service.
Oh, okay.
The all-male jury is already coming back into the courtroom after only 42 minutes.
Ooh.
Now, there's a lot on the line here for Mary and for America.
Oh.
And the verdict is guilty. Newspapers had a field day. Headlines blaring, "Grandmother found guilty."
Oh.
Called the verdict medieval. Some were speculating that the men on this jury must be frightened of sex.
Oh.
And they were clearly trying to keep the next generation of Americans trapped in the Victorian era. Mary herself, however, was more annoyed by the newspaper's fixation on her gray hair. "I am not doddering yet," she told her family.
But I guess it makes it less shocking. She's less scandalous if she has gray hair.
Yes, obviously a grandmother couldn't be circulating obscene material for any salacious purpose. And in fact, she had not. What Mary Ware Dennett had sent through the post and earned herself a $300 fine was a sex education pamphlet that she had written herself for her own sons several years earlier, and had been giving copies of to friends who requested it. News sort of got out. Other parents who were really interested in giving their children an accurate, scientifically based understanding of sex would write to her requesting a copy of this pamphlet. Unfortunately for her, one of the people who wrote to her was an undercover agent for the Comstock campaign to root out vice in America, more commonly known as the Comstock laws, still on the books, by the way, which forbade distribution of any communication about sex, contraception, abortion, or even portrayals of relationships in literature or in art that the Comstock agents decided might stimulate unhealthy thoughts in young people.
Wow.
So it's a very broad category and is generally just decided by whichever Comstock agent happens to decide that this material is obscene.
Fascinating.
This trial took place in 1929.
Not a good year for America.
Not great year, and I might argue maybe a year when there were other important things to focus on.
Well,
but,
you know.
I'm guessing that almost nobody listening to this episode had ever heard of Mary Ware Dennett. She was an incredibly important voice in United States politics, in women's rights, in reproductive rights, and in women's suffrage, but has been basically completely erased from all of those stories. And thanks to our returning guest, Stephanie Gorton.
Oh, great.
Who, of course, we featured on our episode about Ida Tarbell.
Yeah.
Hopefully that is about to change.
Cool.
I'm Olivia Mickle.
And I'm Katie Nelson.
And this is What's Her Name?
Fascinating women you've never heard of.
Stephanie Gorton has written another brilliant joint biography this time of Margaret Sanger, who I think most Americans at least probably know her name, and Ware Dennett, who was equally influential and important, but nobody knows her name.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Gorton. My most recent book is The Icon and the Idealist, Margaret Sanger, Ware Dennett, and the Rivalry That Brought Birth Control to America. It's a dual biography of the two women, of course, but I really wanted to trace the cultural changes that brought sex and birth control from taboo into the mainstream. I also love character-driven stories, and these are two really fascinating characters. I thought putting a relationship at the center of the story of a radical cultural movement could be interesting, as opposed to making it hero-villain. In a way, both of these people are heroes and both are villains. It's complicated, essentially. When you have a trial scene, it's hard not to open there, especially when there is some drama and when you know it was a really big deal at the time, and when the central topic is sex. So it opens with Ware Dennett. She's in her late 50s and she's facing a federal indictment for obscenity. When her sons were teenagers, she wrote a booklet called The Sex Side of Life, which was meant to teach them the facts of life.
So this is from her introduction to The Sex Side of Life. We have come across so much rubbish on this subject that we've drifted into the conclusion that an honest sex essay for young folks would not be produced by this generation.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. It's frankly still better than a lot of what is taught in public schools in many U.S. states. It is certainly more informative and accurate than anything I was taught in my public school.
She illustrated it herself, and it was kind of revolutionary at the time. It didn't have any injunctions about abstinence. It didn't talk about the dangers of masturbation, which were a very normal feature of the sex ed at the time. Often booklets would tie masturbation to criminality or insanity. She didn't include any of that. She said worrying about it causes much more damage than actually doing it.
It also, incredibly shockingly at the time, and this is probably what got her in trouble, put equal emphasis on men and women's enjoyment of sex. The idea that women could enjoy sex at all was still very much in debate in medical and social circles. And there were lots of doctors insisting that the female orgasm did not exist.
But there were and also so many centuries old folklore traditions where you could, depending on the woman's experience, that would determine whether it was a boy or a girl or,
right,
still today,
yeah,
all kinds of different opinions.
Yeah, you have this sort of very peak Victorian overlay over centuries of folk knowledge and scientific knowledge and cultural interpretations, all of that really impacting the way that sex is talked about and taught, if at all, in America.
And she had originally written it for her own kids, and then friends started asking her for copies. Over the years, over the 15 years preceding the trial, she had worked this up to a kind of steady side business. She fulfilled an order from a customer in Virginia who turned out to be a vice agent. So accidentally, without knowing it, Dennett sends a copy of her booklet to a Comstock Act agent. And that's where her arrest comes from. She was not a birth control campaigner from her early career or by education. She was an artist and designer from a relatively genteel Boston family of modest means.
Ware Dennett was born in Boston in 1872. Her dad died when she was very young, and her mother supported the family by taking wealthy young women on European tours.
Oh, fun.
This is, their grand tour at the end of finishing school, proving that they are, in fact, finished. And so Mary is living part-time, at least with her aunt, Lucia Ames Mead, who was a very well-known peace activist, suffragist, reformer, powerhouse woman.
Huh.
So this is a family that's very educated, very socially engaged, not financially very well off, but socially very connected.
Dennett had other ancestors who had worked for abolition. She came from a kind of fiery family. She described her ancestors as New England granite. These are people who really lived out their ideals, and that was an expectation for her. She tried to lead a different life. She tried to become an artist, and she and her husband had this sort of utopian plan for their lives where they would work side by side, live in the countryside, and almost like early 20th century hippies. But of course, that took a hard turn, but also led her to the birth control movement, where in a way, those ancestral traits really came to the fore.
Mary attended the Boston Museum of Fine Arts School of Art and Design,
Cool.
graduated with first honors, and then taught for several years at the Drexel Institute of Art in Philadelphia. Eventually, she marries William Hartley Dennett, who was an architect in 1900. And these two are of one mind. They share the ideals of the arts and crafts movement.
Oh, me too.
And
The arts and crafts movement being the Victorian version of what we would call crunchy today.
yes, very much. Sort of this rejection of industrial encroachments on design, what they see as like this lowering of production and aesthetic values, returning to nature and simplicity and form and beauty in our art and our home design.
And handmade stuff instead of factory-made stuff.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes from, I can't remember who in arts and crafts, but they complained that the design of the time was creating novelty without beauty and beauty without intelligence. They're very much in this movement. It's not just an aesthetic, it's a movement, right?
For sure.
And together, they start an architectural and design firm. He is doing the architecture, she's doing the interior design.
It was after she married and started having children that her fertility obviously started to concern her much more, because her children came quite close together. She had 3 sons, and she suffered serious birth injuries after each one was born. She probably developed a fistula, which is an abnormal cavity in the genital region, and it cannot be repaired without surgery. It's not something that heals on its own. It can be extremely incapacitating and humiliating. After her second son was born, the physical trauma was such that she couldn't feed him. He wouldn't take any formula, and he died of malnutrition when he was 3 weeks old. She gets pregnant again, and after having a third son, thankfully healthy, doctors told Dennett and her husband that they shouldn't have any more children, that another pregnancy could kill her. But there's no birth control information attached to this advice, so they stopped having sex. That was the expected action they would take. They simply stopped having sex.
And this is common at the time when a woman shouldn't get pregnant again. They just say, don't get pregnant. And that did not turn out well for a lot of people in a variety of different ways. In this case, what it means is that Dennett's husband starts having affairs and eventually leaves her in a very scandalous, very humiliating divorce.
She has this public and really humiliating divorce in Boston. Her husband's infidelity was public. It was something that lots of people talked about and commented on. It was even the topic of a play that was put on in town at that time. This was really excruciating for Dennett. And she ended up not only with sole custody of her kids, but sole financial responsibility for them.
She's also lost her livelihood, right? The architectural design firm was co-owned with her husband. When the marriage ends, her career is gone.
I think that motivated both her birth control work and her sex ed work, wanting to make the world a better place for the next generation. She was deeply invested in that. She herself had been raised in a very prudish household. She saw her relatives bathe wearing their nightgowns and been raised to believe that she would be a very bad, dirty person if she looked at her own body too long or thought about her own body too much. She wanted her kids to be better equipped. So that's why she trawled the entire literature of sex ed and stripped away everything she thought was too informed by fear or shame, and really tried to write things out in the most positive, scientifically informed way that she could. And same thing with birth control. She really saw how her life would have been completely different if she had had it.
She's horrified at her own ignorance, that she did not know really important information. Her husband didn't know. They weren't given information that could have completely changed their lives and saved her health and maybe saved their marriage. And she's grown up in this model in her own family, in her own society, of this very repressive Victorian sexual norm that has shaped her life and, in her opinion, ruined her life. And she's very determined that that will not pass on to her kids. And that's really the core of this work for her around sex education, around birth control, trying to prevent the harm that was done to her from passing on to the next generation.
It's so unfair that she's been relegated to obscurity. It's also partly due to her character. Dennett was so fiercely private. She really just assessed her life and her career on how she was able to push it forward and how far she was able to take it. She didn't want people to recognize her name or her face. She just wanted to achieve something. I think the one time Dennett maybe stepped into the spotlight and maybe enjoyed it a little more, or rather than enjoyed it, I should say saw the advantages of it and was glad to occupy that place, was during her free speech trial for The Sex Side of Life, her sex education booklet. So there she seems much more comfortable and kind of at peace with the fact that she's in the headlines from day to day. She didn't always like the way that reporters talked about her. They kept characterizing her as like a grandmother, like a little old lady. And she was in her 50s and she was full of beans, kind of at the height of her power. She had retreated from lobbying, but she was making art. She was doing all kinds of advocacy. And yet the press saw, this is a hook for an interesting story about this lovable little crone who's peddling sex literature. Although the better papers were much more analytical and almost universally on her side, talking about how this is a necessary step for freedom of speech and how young people should have the right to learn about sex in the same way that they learned about every other biological function, that there shouldn't be some special censorship or sense of shame or fear attached to it. That was a major cultural leap. Her New York Times obituary didn't even mention her birth control work, but it did talk about her fight for free speech. And after the decision was reversed, that really opened the door not only for other books that touched on sex as a scientific matter to be published, but even for literature, like Ulysses by James Joyce. Her whole theory was that herself as an individual was completely irrelevant to the movement. If she had this very selfless kind of integrity. But I think that also comes from incidents in her own life. She had a lot of press attention during her divorce and just really distrusted the press and publicity ever since then. She definitely looked down on Sanger for embracing the idea of shaping this persona in the press and managing the press and being able to stoke outrage in the press.
Margaret Sanger was, of course, the founder of Planned Parenthood and is kind of regarded as the mother of birth control in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes celebrated for that and sometimes villainized for that. And, of course, more lately, there's been a lot more attention paid to some really very problematic things in Margaret Sanger's pretty unabashed embrace of eugenics.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of controlling the bloodlines, lowering the birth rates in certain populations, raising the birth rates in other populations. Of course, as well as seeing birth control as a way for individuals to control their own reproduction. So, of course, that has pretty thoroughly tainted the way that Margaret Sanger is viewed now for at least some modern audiences. And also, unfortunately, provides a really easy target for folks who are trying to maybe invalidate or roll back these rights to birth control access, because it gives you a really easy kind of bad faith argument to say, well, Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist, so obviously that means we should ban birth control.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly the extremes, right? But I must agree with Stephanie Gorton that now is a great time to remind everyone that Margaret Sanger was not, in fact, the only person in America advocating for women's rights to make decisions about when and if and how they wanted to get pregnant.
The problem of the single story again.
I know. It turns out that there were, in fact, multiple people involved in that movement and multiple groups with varying goals and views and approaches to what would become one of the most transformative campaigns for women's rights and women's lives in U.S. history.
Cool.
But this biography, by framing these two together in the story, it's a really brilliant way of examining all of the different conversations that were happening within that conversation. And yeah, undoing that single story, undoing those easy and usually very misleading narratives about how this whole thing happened.
Sanger was so good at making herself into this hero and this martyr figure and weaving a myth around herself. And I think that has translated into the writing about her ever since. But I really think that Dennett saw this coming. In doing my research, her things were just arranged extremely neatly, and no one else had done that. She had labeled her files, she labeled all her things, even her clothes and her wallets and her jewelry. I really got the feeling, and her relatives kind of confirmed this, that she foresaw a biographer coming along. You could see that deep down, she suspected someone would come along and write about her, which I love. She really had to contend with navigating patriarchal institutions that were hostile to her. But at first, her whole persona of being a mother, of not being super young, she was in her 40s when she first started lobbying for birth control, it really seemed to help her lay the groundwork to make these ideas more acceptable. I think the prevailing anxiety was that if women had, especially if young girls had access to birth control, they would experiment with sex, that they would feel more free and feel less fear. But it's hard to believe that this petite person with gray hair and glasses is really there to ruin the young.
So how did Mary Ware Dennett make the leap from sex ed and suffrage to birth control? And how did she and Margaret Sanger become frenemies at the very least? Bitter antagonists by the end? It all began in a secret Greenwich Village feminist club in 1914.
Dennett had joined this secretive feminist club called Heterodoxy. There's a really great book about it by Joanna Scutts called Hotbed.
Joanna Scutts being, of course, our beloved former guest from our episode about Marjorie Hillis and the author of The Extra Woman.
I love it.
There were all kinds of fascinating feminists who came together at Heterodoxy. She went to a lecture where Margaret Sanger was talking about birth control. Sanger was actually really annoyed by having that assignment. She thought the audience was full of these hyper-intellectual feminists who care more about whether or not women should keep their last names after marriage, whether they should maintain their own residence after marriage. Just these very privileged problems, these questions that the world Sanger moved in, the world of the tenements, of laundresses, of labor disputes, of factories. No one was talking about those things in Sanger's world.
But in the audience is Mary Ware Dennett, whose mind is blown by this. She approaches Sanger and invited her over for lunch.
They spent a long afternoon together. And at the beginning, at least, it seemed like they were going to be good friends.
It seems like this is going to be a dream team. These two are going to be able to launch this movement together with these two sides of the skill set that they hold.
1914 is when Sanger and Dennett first meet. And then in 1915, Dennett and a group of others formed the National Birth Control League. So it's the first national advocacy organization specifically for promoting birth control. The only reason Sanger was a part of it was because she had been arrested on charges relating to the Comstock Act. She had mailed out a magazine that was deemed obscene, and instead of standing trial, she decided that she should leave the country for a year, marshal her resources before she was put in prison for an indeterminate amount of time. The Comstock Act was a really harsh law. A first-time offender could expect to be fined $5,000 or spend 5 years in prison. In practice, the full penalty wasn't exerted all that often, but it still would have made someone in Sanger's phase of life, an activist just getting off the ground, someone who would just transition from being a visiting nurse in tenement neighborhoods to trying to lead a movement. I can see it would have made her think twice. So she traveled to England under an assumed name, and she lived in Europe for a year. During that time, Mary Ware Dennett formed the National Birth Control League.
Now, when we say birth control, I'm not talking about birth control pills here, right? That's decades later. We're talking about mostly physical barriers, diaphragms, caps.
No, I was thinking pills. Oh.
And that will become part of the campaign later, but we're still just talking about anything that could prevent conception is murky legal territory and a problem.
And it was up against some pretty formidable obstacles. Legally, of course, the Comstock Act was the big one. The Comstock Act put a severe chill, a real freezing effect on the market for birth control methods and information. At that time, what it really meant was that diaphragms and douching devices, sometimes condoms, sometimes various kinds of IUDs, they could not be distributed via mail order, and doctors had a real fear that prescribing them would be breaking the law. The most commonly used method of birth control at that time anyway was withdrawal, but that was deployed by men. And there was a real absence of birth control methods that could be deployed by women that were legal, affordable, accessible, especially considering that a large proportion of the population wouldn't have had running water. So between the legal obstruction of the Comstock Act, the cultural obstruction of this very strong taboo, Dennett had her work cut out for her.
She also faces a lot of eugenics-based opposition, right? Eugenics is really, really tied in with the birth control movement at this time. And she is utilizing that in some political ways, but she's also facing some stiff opposition based on eugenics that birth control encourages the wrong people to stop having children, that we need certain people to have more children, and this will just make those people have fewer children. What they're saying there, of course, is that wealthy women, wealthy white Protestant women, already have access to birth control, even in this murky legal gray area, and they're having fewer children because they have doctors who are willing to fudge the rules for their very wealthy, powerful patients. And poor people, non-white people, all of these people who were, in these people's view, seen as less desirable, are having more children. And so all of these things are making it really hard for her to make any meaningful headway on this issue.
what happened when Sanger came back from Europe after that year away, she was still due to stand trial for mailing out this booklet that had been deemed obscene. And she came, and first thing she did was ask Dennett and the new National Birth Control League for moral and financial support. During the preceding year, Dennett had been lobbying to try and repeal the New York State censorship laws so that birth control information and methods could at least circulate in New York State. And she really felt she had made some headway in the legislature. She did not want to be tied in reputation to a lawbreaker like Margaret Sanger.
And so she said no. Mary Ware Dennett said, we are building credibility and we cannot be tied to this case. And I'm really sorry, but there's nothing we can do to help you.
Too bad.
To be fair, they didn't have any money. They didn't have any financial support to give. But it really, really felt like a betrayal to Margaret Sanger. And she was very upset at this, what is truthfully just cutting her off on this project that they thought they were aligned on.
So from that point on, they're really never able to work together. They formed separate advocacy leagues. They have different visions for what a birth control law should look like or how far it should be legalized. Dennett believed that simply deleting the prohibition on birth control from the Comstock Act would be the simplest and most equitable way to do it. That way, it would be easy to mail order a diaphragm, or you could get one fitted by a local nurse or maybe even a social worker.
And Sanger thought that that was never going to happen. Sanger was really determined to keep doctors in the loop. She felt like if we build this bridge with the medical establishment, then that will get powerful men on our side. And so if we say only a doctor can prescribe these things, then we'll be able to get these men on board and we'll have powerful allies.
That's interesting.
Dennett is an idealist. She is firm in her egalitarian principles here that this should be accessible to everyone. Everyone should be able to get this information. Everyone should be able to get these devices. And you can't just put another man in the middle again over this thing that should really be for women to decide for themselves.
That's really where Dennett turns into the idealist of the title. Because that kind of compromise, that kind of pragmatism, she was pretty much allergic to it. It didn't do Dennett's movement many favors to have this open disagreement with Sanger. Except, of course, today, Sanger is so closely allied with the eugenics movement, and Dennett was nowhere near as fervent about eugenics as Sanger was.
Dennett would leave several suffrage groups because of the really deeply embedded white supremacy that was going on there. And now she's seeing the same thing happening again as eugenics is rising in this birth control fight. And it makes the birth control argument even harder for her to navigate because it's so tied to this.
I do believe from reading her personal letters as well as her professional papers or the papers of the National Birth Control League and the league she started later, that this was something she pursued because she thought it would be helpful politically. But she definitely, there's no way of separating that early effort for birth control and eugenics. They were connected pretty much from the beginning. There were two words that got thrown around constantly, the fit versus the unfit. And Dennett definitely joined in. I think she really saw that humanitarian reasoning just didn't get very far when she was lobbying in Congress. But if she could connect her arguments for birth control to eugenics or to the economy, then people seem to listen a little more. And I think depressingly, that's something we see today in the conversation around reproductive rights also. So yes, she definitely talked about how families would be smaller, but of higher quality. She talked about how spacing babies was like spacing vegetables in a garden, would allow for the highest quality growth for the nation.
She has this weird statistic she keeps using about how in the Netherlands, birth control became legal, and since those clinics opened, the average height of a Dutch man had risen by 4 inches.
Wow.
So
Okay.
she's saying, like, hey, American men, you could also be taller. It's that same
Sure.
thing that's rising up all over the world, right? This idea of sort of engineering better humans that can take various forms and various levels of creepiness.
Yeah.
But this idea of, you know, if you let women access birth control, your sons will be taller. It's a weird balance that she's trying to walk here.
And then in 1927, Buck v. Bell gives the state the right to sterilize its citizens, which hugely disproportionately affected Black women. I mean, this is such a dark chapter in American history, and these ideas were mainstream at the time and inspired writers and thinkers and politicians in Europe. And it wasn't until after the atrocities of the Nazi regime came to light that eugenics died down in the US. Later on, when her campaign was clearly faltering, her colleagues really urged her to try and find a way to work with Sanger, find a way to unify. At the time, the rift between them was a huge disadvantage because donors didn't really know where to donate, which version of the cause was the proper one to support. And it also gave elected leaders a reason to say, well, you clearly have some issues to sort out because I'm hearing 2 separate things from 2 different campaigns. And that was a really handy pretext for them. On the other hand, what Dennett was actually asking for was more radical. She wanted to make the marketplace more open. You know, I think she really thought that the federal laws should reflect the way people actually lived and should reflect the American values of equality of opportunity for all. And if the doctor's only path was pursued, then poor women would have far less access to birth control. So she went to Washington, she got herself an apartment, and between 1919 and 1924, she would just go from office to office, trying to get a meeting with senators and representatives. After a first meeting with her, many of them try to fob her off on their secretaries or say that they're sick. There are some really brazen excuses she gets. Her campaign diaries are great on this point. Most elected leaders were hostile to the idea of birth control, but she found a few who were open to it and agreed to sponsor it. To see her hopes rise and fall over the course of these 5 grueling years. Their bill is introduced and discussed several times, but every single time it's kind of laughed out of the chamber. And she has to sit and watch this happen. She brings extremely carefully assembled data to every hearing. I think that's a very New England Enlightenment way of thinking, that if information is just shared more fully and more openly, then our whole society will be stronger, will be closer to the light. And that's really what she believed.
If you give them good information,
It's a good hope.
everyone will understand, and every reasonable person will agree if you just give them the information. And so if they're not agreeing, they just don't have the information. You're not being clear enough with the information.
Yeah.
Women are dying. Women are having horrific childbirth injuries. This is destroying families. It's destroying marriages. Obviously, if we can prevent that from happening, this is an obvious social good. And so all I have to do is explain to people, and everyone will understand.
I think that's also why she didn't position herself as this central hero of the movement.
She doesn't need to be the hero of the movement because it's obvious. It's just about facts. It's just about presentation of information.
She wrote a few books herself. She wrote one called Birth Control Laws that was essentially just outlining birth control laws and birth control related campaigns in a variety of countries and states, really presenting it to the reader, asking, what do you think the future should look like? And what do you think is reasonable? This was, I think, very much like an extended version of the pitch that she gave elected leaders when she was doing her lobbying. And it really shows, she's like, well, I'm not important, but these ideas are, and surely you care deeply about ideas.
And she's constantly baffled when it doesn't work. That's really hard for this utopian idealist worldview that she has.
She didn't see, the kinds of positions that elected leaders were in, of worrying about whether constituents would reelect them, of being worried about losing funding, of being associated with a cause that was related to a taboo and that definitely wasn't taken seriously by the mainstream in the United States. One of the campaigns in Congress that Dennett shadowed while she was starting to put together her birth control campaign there was a Maternity and Infant Care Act. She realized what she was contending with when one elected leader said, well, if this funding goes to these clinics, then doctors will have much less work, and that will be bad for the economy. And someone who was arguing for this legislation said, are you seriously saying the health of the population is not worth as much as medical establishment having the income and the security that they currently have? But that was really taken seriously. And the maternal and infant health at that time was just so dire, especially for people of color. There was one quote from a doctor that really stuck with me. He said, I think humans must be related to salmon because after they spawn, they seem designed to die. And she has a couple of really startling experiences. At one hearing, an opponent stands up to speak, and she had gotten to know the major vocal opponents at that point. There would always be a representative from the Catholic Church. There would always be a few more moral purity or social purity minded campaigners saying, abstinence should be what we're urging, not birth control. But then there was one opponent Dennett had not expected. She was a member of her own league, a woman who'd been volunteering with her for years. But it turned out she'd been a spy. There were just all kinds of incidents that made it so admirable to me that Dennett just kept going after it. So I came to really feel that Dennett was the emotional center of this book. She finally goes broke and really ruins her health and retreats from Congress in 1924. And so from that point on, the League is pretty much dormant, and she occupies herself with sending these persistent needling letters to Margaret Sanger, trying to get her to expand her campaign, to open up that doctors-only compromise and instead focus on repealing a couple phrases from the Comstock Act so that at least birth control would be legal. And of course, that was never successful. Sanger was determined that she would push through a bill where doctors had this gatekeeping role over birth control. She campaigned for that really through 1934, and her bill even briefly passed before being recalled 15 minutes later. Because Sanger's bill ultimately failed, Sanger ended up making the decision to move her campaign into the courts. Case where finally, in 1936, it became possible for doctors to prescribe contraception.
In 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut gave all married Americans access to birth control.
Wow.
And this is one of those things that, especially when I'm talking to my students, when I talk to people, anyone younger than me in America, they are flabbergasted at these dates. the idea that birth control was not legal until 1965, and that it was only legal for married women until 1972. That's shocking. It's ridiculous to so many people because it's so hard to understand how this could have been
Now it feels
that difficult.
Yeah, it's always been around.
So that's how we access birth control today. That's how it is available to us. And that's very unique to the United States. In the UK and France and Canada and Mexico, there are national laws on the books affirming the right to contraception. I think there is a real legacy of the fact that Sanger's strategy ended up working better. I mean, it clearly was more pragmatic. It was more likely to find success in her lifetime. But I can definitely see a real legacy of it in the fact that many countries made the pill an over-the-counter medication years and years ago. It's safer than many kinds of painkiller, for example. But in the US, that only happened last year in 2023.
What is interesting about figures like Mary Ware Dennett, the almost rands, the bright failures, the buried drafts of the past, is that they're liable to suddenly start speaking to us again. We can choose, if we like, to listen.
Huge thanks to Stephanie Gorton. Visit our website at what'shernamepodcast.com where you can find links, resources, photos, and more.
You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, where we post lots of photos each week.
Music in this episode was provided by Asher Fulero, Kevin Macleod, the Mini Vandals, Late Night Feeler, Jeff Cuno, Cooper Cannell, Dan Bodan, and the American Quartet.
Our theme song was composed and performed by Daniel Foster Smith.
Our intern is Katie Boucher. What's Her Name is produced by Olivia Mickle and Katie Nelson, and this episode was edited by Olivia Mickle. Cocaine in your toothpaste.
Yeah.
But no diaphragm for you.